Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you would like to jump directly to a different point in the video, there are chapter links to the different sections right there in the video timeline. So this week I have some tidbits. I have an update on my progress with my Roaring 20s sweater project. And I'm going to answer some questions that have come up in my Ravelry group and in the comments of my videos. So let's get started. First of all, it's very hot here in Minnesota this week. It's about 90 degrees, which is I think around 32, 33 Celsius, and with a feels like temperature of about 95, which is 35 Celsius. We have air conditioning in our house. But we set it at 82 degrees, which is about 28 Celsius, and I'm upstairs. So it's very hot. Normally I would have a fan going, but I can't do that because it would just be in the background of the video. So I'm hoping I won't melt before this video finishes off. Good news about Craftsy Bluprint, in case you haven't heard, is that a company actually here in Minneapolis or in the Twin Cities area, it's called TN Marketing Company. They have all these various creative video streaming services. They have like some woodworking and quilting and various other things. They bought Craftsy Bluprint from NBC Universal. So the past few months, Bluprint announced that they were going to be closing their doors, so to speak. And so a lot of us had bought classes from Craftsy or Bluprint over the years and didn't know how we were going to save them. There were some ways that you could download them if you had a specific app, and I do everything on my computer, and it was just like, I didn't have that many classes. I was just gonna let them go, but I was kind of upset because there was one class that I had bought that I do refer back to over and over again. And so I was like, oh, that's too bad that I won't be able to do it. But they announced that TN Marketing has purchased that video streaming software or video streaming service. Sounds like from the press releases and the websites and stuff that maybe they're going to continue creating content. But it's not clear how that's going to happen. But the good news is that that you will be able to access your classes going forward. So I belong to the Weavers Guild here in Minnesota. They are the organization. They have not just weaving classes, but they also have spinning classes and dyeing classes, and they bring in special guests to teach things, and it's a nice organization. But I joined it in order to learn to spin. But I get there, I think it's every other week, they send an electronic newsletter. And this week they sent in, or they included a book called The Golden Thread, How Fabric Changed History by Kassia St. Clair. It's sort of like a virtual book club that the Weavers Guild is doing. But I was interested in seeing what this book was about, and they included a link to an interview with this author who was interviewed on a podcast called Tea and Tattle. So I'm going to include the name of the book as well as a link to that podcast down in the video, because it sounds really interesting. I want to get a hold of that book. I don't have it yet, but it sounds interesting, and it sounds like it would be fun to participate with a discussion of that book with other members of the Weavers Guild. So you won't be able to do that if you're not a member of our Weavers Guild, but you might be able to get the book, and also you can listen to the podcast. So when I was looking into this author, she has also written another book called, I'll have to put the name of it. It's about color. I don't know if it's the history of color or something like that, but it looks fascinating. There's 75 colors that she talks about, and the pages will have that color on it, and and the name of the color, and then sort of the history behind it, which sounds really interesting. So those are 2 books that I'm looking forward to learning more about, and I will leave links to them down below. About a month or so ago, I was showing you how I do my knitting experiments, and I was talking about Russian grafting and the process that I would go through to swatch for different things. And I started a thread in my Ravelry group on that. And then, you know, there's so much stuff was going on and at the time, and I didn't get back to it. Yesterday, oh, my friend Ole Petter from Sweden sent me an email, and he said, oh, have you seen this blog post? And it's from Assia Brill, is that her name? Yes, Assia Brill. She wrote the book Distitch that I talked about earlier this year. So she's Russian. She lives, I think she lives in the UK, but she had done a blog post on Russian grafting. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. I'm going to take a look at that. I haven't read it yet. But in the meantime, like yesterday, she came to the Rox Rocks group and found that thread on Russian grafting, and she showed her experiments with Russian grafting. So she really knows her stuff, and I think it's really interesting. So I'm going to leave a link to that thread in my Rox Rocks group, and you can see all her swatches and all the experiments that she has done, which I think is really interesting. She went far beyond anything I could have done. She's already knows Russian grafting to begin with, and so it's really interesting for me to see her process, coming at it from an experienced Russian grafter, to see how she approached it and what she had to say about different things. Speaking of my friend Ole Petter, again, a couple of months ago, I was asking him if he knew of any, or if he could recommend any books on traditional Swedish knitting, not twined knitting, but other like stranded color work things, if he could recommend any. And he recommended a couple of books, which I showed you guys before. One of them was this one called Swedish Sweaters by Britt-Marie Christopherson. And the other was not specifically Swedish, but he's like, you know, everything's so intertwined up there. And you can see that when you look at this. But this is knitting in the Nordic tradition right here. So I bought these 2 books used. And then there was another book called, I think it was called The Mitten Book. And I cannot find it. It's here in my office somewhere. But that book was based on a book that was originally published in the 1920s by this woman who'd gone to Gotland and had sort of accumulated all these traditional stitch patterns. And so what the Mitten Book did, which was published much more recently, was they took all of those stitch patterns that she had collected in her original book, and then they knit them up in mitten patterns, and they were photographed in color, and they have all the charts there. And I was really not understanding what the original book was. And Ole Petter said, oh, well, you know, she had other designs in there. She had sweaters and mittens and, you know, various things in that book, and that they were photographs of them. And then he said there was a reproduction of that original book was done a couple of years ago. And he happened to know the person who had bought all of the leftover copies, and that the next time he saw that person, he would get me a copy. And he did, and he sent it to me. And this is the book. And I was so excited to look at it. And I opened it up, and I was like, oh, yeah, it's in Swedish. So I've been working on, like, with the beginnings, the forewords in the beginning, like going through Google Translate to try to see if I can figure out what it's all about. But it has, the photographs in here are actually really great. And so she has a lot of mitten patterns in here. And these look like they were original things, because some of, like, this mitten right here has a lot of holes in it, or has a big hole in it. And she's got, you know, there's socks in there that have stranded cuffs at the top. And there's like some little, you know, there's a sweater, things like that. So this is really fascinating. I'm so grateful to have Oli Petter as my friend, and he knows like all of the big Swedish knitters, I think. And so, so I'm so happy that he was able to send this to me. So the last thing I want to talk about in my tidbits is, I didn't mention this last week, and a part of it was I think I was repressing a little bit. I did my third live stream on June 21st on Sunday, and the topic was short rows. And I had really prepared for this. I had all of these samples. I was going to demonstrate with my overhead camera, and we had so many technical difficulties. I could not do anything with the overhead, which meant how was I going to explain this stuff with just my front-facing camera? So the issue with live streaming for me, the main issue is that my computer is really old. It's from 2013. So even just editing these kinds of videos really strains my computer. And like I have to shut everything else down while it's processing. And it means that when I'm doing what's called exporting, when I finished editing my videos and I export them to create a file that I can then upload to YouTube, however long the video is, that's how long it takes it to export, which means I cannot do anything on my computer during that time, including writing up the description of the video and getting the timestamps figured out and collecting all the links together. I can't do any of that while it's exporting. So that's just something I live with, you know, when I do these videos, fine. But it's created a problem with the live streams. So each live stream we've tried, you know, something different to try to, you know, make them technically better. The first live stream I used just the webcam in my computer, and then we used my iPhone for the overhead, and we had this app that allowed it to talk to the, you know, we had that set up, but the webcam was kind of crappy. So we used a better webcam that my husband had for his computer, and that was a little better for the face of the camera. So this third one, we used a new app or a different app for the overhead stuff. And my computer just can't handle the two cameras, and it just can't do it. And so we've been experimenting. I bought a second webcam that's like the first one, which was not easy because there's a webcam shortage with COVID. Everybody bought up webcams so they can do their Zoom meetings. So that was a trick. And we've been trying different things like with my computer and what some other computers we have in the house. And we finally figured out what setup we need, but it's going to require a new computer. So I have to order a new computer. So it's going to be a while before I do another live stream. But in the meantime, when I did the live stream with Suzanne Bryan a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about how the way we make money off our YouTube videos is through ad revenue. That's one way we make money. So if you let the ads run, that helps generate money, and which means I can use that money toward doing things like upgrading my equipment. Because the videos are free for you to watch, but they're not free for me to make. So in terms of time and as well as just equipment. So what I have noticed, a lot of people said, oh, I didn't know that about the ad revenue. I'm going to, you know, let them play. And I can see that that has made a difference in how much revenue is getting generated from my videos, which is really helpful. So thank you for that. And I just want to let you know I will be doing more live streams in the future, but I have to upgrade my computer first because apparently 7-year-old equipment just isn't going to cut it. So anyway, thanks for allowing the ads to play. I really appreciate it. It is getting a little hot in here. So I made quite a bit of progress on the sweater this past week. It's not quite finished, but I did do quite a bit. First of all, I finished weaving in all the ends. I was trying to weave in ends, you know, as I was knitting this. As I knit the back, whenever I'd finish one of these stripes, I'd weave the ends in pretty much. But then as I was coming down the front, I stopped doing that. So I've been catching up with the end weaving. I think there's something like 550 ends altogether. A lot. So what I did last week, I had knit the wristband, or not knit, crocheted the wristband for the sleeve. And I showed you how I had increased the circumference of the upper arm of the sleeve and added a little room in the underarm, how I'd put gussets in. So if you didn't see that, I'll leave a link at the top to the video that showed how I do that. So what I have done since then is I don't know if I had outlined them before, but I had to outline these slashes at the bottom of the sleeve with crochet, and then I had to seam the sleeve into the wristband. So the wristband is like 7 inches in circumference, and when you add up all of the edges of the sleeve, it was about 11 inches in circumference. So you have to seam quite a bit more of sleeve into the wristband. Then the next thing I did was I had to knit I keep saying knit, crochet all of the squares for the collar. And this is the thing that I really have been most concerned about for this sweater, because it's around the collar. It's the collar. It's what you see when, you know, that's the most obvious part of the sweater. I wanted it to look good, and I am not a crocheter. I know the rudiments of it, but that's it. So I really practiced a lot during the course of this project, and I had at one point crocheted all of the squares, and I started to do the outline, and I didn't like the way the outlining was going. I didn't like the way it looked. And so I asked you guys for help, and I asked for help in the All Things Vintage group on Ravelry, and there was a crochet designer who gave me some good tips about what to do, which was to outline each square with single crochet in that color, whatever color the square was, and then do the black by crocheting through the back loop, and then do the white by crocheting through the back loop. And that is what gives me the nice sharp black line. The problem with doing that with the original squares was that crocheting around with that color adds some width to it. So what I had to do was recrochet those squares so that they were smaller, that they were 2 stitches narrower, so that when I crocheted around them, it would make them the original width, and then it could do that. Because if they're too wide, then they're going to be too big for the collar. So I needed the collar to fit correctly. So I got the squares, the colored squares done, and then you chain them together with single crochet, and then you put 2 chains in between each one. So you create basically like a little bunting or a little banner of all of those. And then I pinned it around just to make sure it was actually going to fit correctly. And then I had to pin it to the actual neckline. And I had to figure out how I was going to sew this on. So I'm very good at seaming. When I have knitted fabric and I'm seaming together with I usually use mattress stitch of one sort or another. And with mattress stitch, with seaming with knitted fabric, you usually have the 2 pieces of fabric with the right sides facing up. You lay them down on a table, and you have their edges. The edges that are going to be seamed, you just have them lying next to each other. And so you seam from the right side. You can see the 2 edges, and you seam from the right side, and you end up with the edges will be on the inside of the seam, or you can't see them, and it looks really tidy. Well, the problem, I had two challenges here. One is that I was sewing a crochet fabric to knitted fabric, and the stitch sizes were not the same. And the stitch counts were not the same. And the second is that the right sides are both facing up, but one of them is lying on top of the other. So, you know, I'm sewing, you know, this edge here to that edge there. And how do I do that so that it's neat? Because that's going to be what's exposed. If I sewed them together from down here, then you might see a lump on the right side. So I had to try to figure out what technique was I going to use, what was going to give me the best result. So what I ended up doing is on the crochet piece of fabric, I took my yarn needle and I grabbed like 2 prongs from the single crochet. So it's sort of like how you'd use mattress stitch. So it's between the chain and like the prongs of the single crochet. And then I needed to figure out what was I going to grab or capture from the knit side of the fabric or from the knitted fabric, doing it from the wrong side of the fabric, the purl side. What I ended up doing was catching, you know, a selvage stitch has 2 legs like any stitch does. And so the leg of the stitch that was on the most outside edge, that is what I captured. But I was still kind of afraid. It was nice flat seam on both sides. It's nice and flat. But I was afraid that right at that edge that the purl side of the fabric was going to show. But it doesn't. It rolls really nicely. And the reason that it rolls is because that is a vertical edge, basically. It's diagonal, but it's basically a vertical edge of stockinette. And what stockinette wants to do at vertical edges is roll toward the purl side of the fabric. So this is wanting to kind of, these edges here are kind of rolling under a little bit, so it hides that actual place where they're attached, and so that they just kind of flip over and they sit nicely, which is great. One more challenge, which is the back of the neck, is a bind off edge. So cast on and bind off edges don't roll toward the purl side. They want to roll toward the knit side. So this neck wanted to roll out that way. And I had a different kind of an edge to it. It was, you know, basically I had 2 chain edges, one that was crocheted and one that was a bind off edge. And so I tried a few different things, and eventually what I decided to do was to do the same thing on the crochet piece of fabric where I capture the 2 prongs. And then on the knitted fabric, I captured one of the legs of the bind off chain, and I captured the one, I'm trying to think, it would be the one that was closest to the wrong side of the fabric, I think, is what I ended up doing. So it worked out really well. I really couldn't be happier with this collar. It's so happy. The thing I'm not quite as happy with is the length of the sleeve. This was something I spent a long time trying to figure out, because one of the reasons I knit this sweater, I chose this sweater, is because of these sleeves. I had never seen anything like this, and it just fascinated me. So that meant, so I knew how long the original sleeve was in the original pattern, which is written for one size, but I also realized that that was a very tiny person. And so, you know, I was making modifications to make the thing longer, and I could see that as written, the place that this sleeve, you know, not including the wristband, would have hit me would have been right about here. And you know, so it wouldn't have even reached all the way down to the wristband. So I knew it had to be longer. The problem was I didn't know how long it should be. I didn't know if it needed to be as long as my actual arm was, and then the wristband would kind of push the sleeve up a little bit and help with the puff, or if it should be just as long as my arm is, to the point where it was going to be sewn onto the wristband. Because this extra fabric creates some of the puff, and the slashes also help create more circumference. So I just didn't know how long to make it. I was afraid of making it too short. And I thought, well, if it's a little too short, I can always make the wristband wider. But that was one of the things where it's like, there's no going back, because if I guessed wrong, then in order to fix it, if the length was really off, I would have had to rip back the entire front and the sleeves and restart. And there's no way I would have ever ever done that. So I had to give my best guess, and I think my best guess was to make the sleeve as long as my arm so that it would have to come up a little bit when it was attached to the wristband. And so it's a little too long. I think it really should have just been to the point where it meets the wristband, and then there would have been enough puff. But it's okay, you know, like when you're wearing a sweater, you're moving your arms around anyway. It's not as noticeable to me as the collar. So in terms of having something not work out quite as well as I would have liked, I would prefer the sleeves not being, I would prefer the sleeves being a little too long than having the collar be crappy. So I'm happy about that. One of the problems with the sleeve is these sleeves, because they were knit, horizontally, these slashes were created by binding off on one row, and then we came back casting on. So those are those bind off, cast on edges that want to roll toward the knit side. So these had to be outlined with 2 rounds or 2 rows of single crochet, but they still want to roll a little bit. I have a steamer that I got a few months ago that I love. It's a handheld steamer. I just love it. And I did steam and it helped a little bit. So I haven't, completely washed and blocked this thing yet. And it could be that once I do that, I'll be able to control it a little bit more. But that's one thing where I don't quite like how those edges are behaving, but I might be able to tame them a little further. So what I have left is I still need to sew in this other gusset. I haven't sewn that in yet, and I need to do the sleeve. I have to crochet the wristband. I have to outline the edges of this with crochet, and I have to sew them on. But other than that, it's pretty close to being finished. I just wish it wasn't the hottest time of the year, because even just having this on my lap while I'm working on it, so it's so hot. I'm hoping things will cool off in a couple of weeks and I'll be able to try it on long enough to get some photos of it with me wearing it. Fingers crossed. I have one more thing to talk about with this sweater. I talked last week about how I needed more room for the arm for this sleeve. And because of the way this stitch pattern is created, this whole sweater is knit in one piece, and you have these horizontal striping bands. You can't just add more room here or there. You have to really plan it. I was able to add 3 inches to the total length by adding an extra motif stripe and an extra plain stripe. But I needed more room in the sleeve. A couple inches more room, I was pretty sure, because the sleeve is 11 inches around, and my bicep, my upper arm is at least 12 inches in circumference. So I needed more than that. And my armhole, if you take the circumference of my armhole, it's even larger. So I knew I was going to need a couple of inches just for my sleeve, but I didn't know how much room I would get for my underarm just from the fabric of the sweater, like how much it would extend out to give me room. But what I did know was that this kind of a construction with such a narrow sleeve, and really the body is pretty narrow. I knit it without too much ease to it, that when you have 2 narrow tubes that are joining each other, this tube right here, the fabric is coming like this, and then it has to change directions when it gets to the underarm and come out away from the body in order to go around the arms. That changes the direction that the fabric needs to move at that point where the underarm seams would hit. And that is going to cause some pulling right here if those 2 tubes of fabric are pretty form-fitting. So that's a problem. And it's a problem that knitters solved centuries ago when they created ganzis, fisherman ganzis. Those are working shirts for men on the ocean who are working, and they can't have extra fabric flopping around. So they have to have a shirt a wool shirt where the arms fit snugly and the body fits snugly, but they also need room at that underarm. And that's where you get these diamond shaped gussets where you get a triangle right here in the underarm, and then you get the reverse triangle and the sleeve to give them that room in the underarm without adding any extra bulk. So that's what I wanted to do. And the second thing is, I knew I needed more, you know, a couple inches probably for my arm, but I really didn't, again, know what I needed for the underarm itself. So if I just started the sleeve an inch early and then finished it an inch later, I would have had a 13-inch sleeve that still might not have been big enough at the underarm, or might have produced weird extra fabric when I put my arm down. I didn't know how it was going to fit. And secondly, or thirdly, I'm not sure, I didn't want the circumference of the sleeve to be even larger here, because I'm already sewing 11 inches of fabric to a 7-inch wristband. I didn't want to sew 13 inches of fabric to a 7-inch wristband, and it would have created even more puff at the bottom. So I didn't want to change that. So I knew in my head from the beginning that I was going to need a gusset, some kind of diamond shaped gusset, but I just didn't know how big it would be. And there wasn't really a good way to try this on as I went. It's too hard with the fabric rolling, and it just wasn't possible. So I needed to find a way to knit it in a way that could be altered, and could be altered more than once. If the fix that, you know, if I had knit these gussets and thought this still isn't right, I could have taken the gussets out and reknit them, which wouldn't take that much time. But having to, pull the whole sweater out and reknit it, and then to see, well, did it work this time? That wasn't going to do it for me at all. All right, so I want to answer a couple of questions that have come up in the Rox Rocks group. I have a thread there called Ask Me Anything for Casual Fridays. So these are sort of general questions, not like specific, typically not specific to a particular project. To answer a question for that, you can always ask me questions about your projects in my Rox Rocks group, but that particular thread is really for more general topics that I can talk about here. So the question was from somebody who normally buys like commercially, like big box type of yarns. So they buy yarns that come in like a skein like that. Comes with a center pole skein. No need to rewind the yarn. And she recently bought some hand painted yarn that comes in a hank like this. So it has to be wound up into a ball of some sort before using it. And what she wanted to know was, after she was done knitting with it, did she have to rewind it and put it back into a hank like that? And the answer to that question is no. You might have a Swift and a ball winder, or you might just be doing it by hand in some way. I use a ball winder that gives me a cake like that, a center pole cake. Some people don't like to work from a center pole cake. Some people make a cake but knit from the outside. There's all kinds of ways of winding your yarn. The main thing is that when you wind it, that ball is not super tight. So when the yarn comes in what we call a put up like this, the yarn is really relaxed. And hand painted yarns, you can really see all of the colors in it and what it looks like. It's really pretty. And for an independent dyer, they're going to be creating their hand-dyed yarns in this kind of a setup already. And so it would just be more labor for them to then wind it into some kind of center pole ball. And again, you wouldn't be able to see all of the colors. This is not a hand-dyed yarn. This is Cascade 220. So there are plenty of commercial yarns, big, large commercially produced yarns that come in hanks as well. I would say most of the worsted weight yarns that I buy do come in these kind of hanks, and most of them are just kind of regular old bread and butter, I would call them, worsted weight yarns with nothing particularly special about them. So no, you do not have to rewind them and put them back into a hank. I mean, you could, but there really isn't any reason to. The main point is just to wind it loosely enough that the yarn is still relaxed. So when I use my ball winder, usually there's enough tension on the Swift that it's pulling the yarn enough when I'm winding that the cake is kind of tight. And so I wind it a second time, and then I can do it in a way that it doesn't create that kind of tension on it, and then the cake ends up a lot bigger and a lot looser. And I do some things too, because I'm winding it a second time, that tends to add some twist to the yarn. And then more twist can get added when you're pulling it from the center. And so I do some things when I'm winding the yarn after I'm done with the second time to help eliminate that extra twist when I'm knitting it. So I've done a video on that in the past about avoiding that excess twist, which I'll link to up here. But the short answer to that is when you wind it with your ball winder, you wind it and you're cranking in a certain direction the first time, take it off the ball winder, you pull that center tail out, wind it again, winding in the same direction that you wound the first time. And then when you take it off the ball winder and you have that tail in the center, you push it through to the other side. That will cause it to wind off in the opposite direction than if you had the tail out in the original direction, but that's going to remove twist. But that whole video explains what's going on with the twist and why that happens. But that's what I do. I wind it twice, push the tail through, and then use that center tail when I'm knitting, and that keeps everything nice and loose. I don't have to rewind into a hank. I don't get extra twist in my yarn. The next question is kind of a specific question, but I can answer in a way that generalizes it. So this person said she needs to pick up 173 stitches along a vertical edge. And she said, how do I know how many stitches I have? Do I have to count the rows? Because when you are picking up stitches, when you have, fabric that was knit in this direction and you have to pick up stitches along that edge and you're knitting in the perpendicular direction, you are not going to pick up one stitch for every row along there. And the reason is because you have typically fewer stitches per inch than you do rows per inch. So let's say you're working with worsted weight fabric and you have a piece of fabric that's 10 inches long and your gauge is 5 stitches per inch and 7 rows per inch. So if you have 10 inches of fabric, you probably have 70 rows or very close to it. So that fabric is 10 inches long and you need to create fabric coming out from that 10-inch length that is also 10 inches wide. So if you are working 5 stitches per inch, then 10 inches of fabric is 50 inches or 50 stitches wide. So you need to pick up 50 stitches along an edge where there are 70 rows. What she is asking is, she's like, well, I have 173 stitches. How do I know how many rows that they're existing are right there, so I know what sort of ratio to pick up? Typically, a lot of people pick up 2 stitches for every 3 rows or 3 stitches for every 4 rows, and that will get you pretty close to something that's the right width, but she needs a very specific number of stitches. So here's an approach that I would use for that situation. You could count up all of the rows and then figure out, well, I have 250 rows, but I have 173 stitches, and try to figure out, well, how many stitches do I pick up for each row, whatever. And you could do all of that calculation, and you could pick up all your stitches and then you count them up and you would be off by some number. So I make it easier. I divide up that vertical edge into, you could divide it up into however many equal sections you want. You could divide it up, into just divide it in half and then in half and then in half, so that you have, say, 8 sections. And then figure out, well, if I have to pick up 173 stitches, how many is that in each of those sections? Well, it's about 21 or it's about 22, let's say. And then for that section, you look at how many rows you have. It might not be exactly equal in each one, but you look at that. And And then you figure out, well, if I pick up 2 for every 3, that'll give me about what I want. If you've got a marker placed in each of those sections, as you are picking up stitches, you know how many you've been picking up so far in that section. As you get near this marker, you can say, oh, I still have 3 stitches left to pick up, but I've only got 4 rows. Oh, well, I'll just skip one of the rows. You know, I can pick up 3 stitches for those 4 rows. Or you might say, well, I have 3 stitches left to pick up. Oh, but I only have 3 rows. I'll just pick up 1 for 1 until I get to that marker. And then for the next section, you do the same thing. You pick up about 2 for every 3 or 3 for every 4. And then as you approach that marker, you see how many stitches do I have left to pick up and how many rows are there. And you can kind of eyeball it as you go. So the idea is that the stitches that you picked up are distributed evenly along that edge. So you can divide those edges up into sections if you want. That's one way to do it. Another way is like, if you find, well, I'd have to pick up 21 stitches in 5 of the sections, but 22 in the other 3, and how am I going to remember what I did? Don't. Just pick up 21 in all of the sections, and then see how many you have. And if you are short, say 3 stitches, as you work that first row, do an increase here and there. Spread them out until you have the right number. Or if you picked up 22 for every section, then you're going to have extra stitches that you have picked up. So when you work that first row, just do a couple of decreases. Don't do them all right next to each other. Spread them out, and then you will have the right number of stitches. So the idea is to end up with that number of stitches, but you don't have to pick up that exact number. As long as you're within a couple, you can always adjust in the first row or the first round. So the last question is, what would some of the necessary steps to take to convert a fingering weight sweater into one that uses worsted weight yarn? No particular pattern is in mind yet, just curious in general about what is involved. So for a basic, say, stockinette sweater, all you have to think about is what are the dimensions of each of the pieces of fabric that are going into this sweater. So if it's something that is, if you're knitting it flat in pieces and it's 20 inches wide, how many stitches do you need to make 20 inches worth of stitches using worsted weight? So you're converting, the number of stitches. How many stitches do I need to get that same width? Or if you're working in the round, how many stitches do I need to get that same circumference? So you just have to convert the number of stitches based on measurements and gauge. And then for length, if you need something that's 10 inches long, you're still going to knit 10 inches long. When you get to the shaping parts, though, where you're doing shaping every couple of rows over, a certain number of times, then again you have to convert that. So you have to look at how many times am I decreasing. So what is the total number of stitches that I'm losing, and how wide is that? So that's the amount that you need to lose, but you need to convert that in using your worsted weight gauge. Then you have to look at, well, when I'm doing it in the fingering weight yarn, I'm doing it this many times, how long, how many rows long is that going to be? So what is that actual physical length going to be? Is it going to be over 7 inches or over 5 inches or something like that? So how many rows is 5 inches when I use my worsted weight yarn? And that tells you, well, I have to get rid of, 10 stitches over the course of 30 rows. And so then you have to figure out, well, how often do I have to do those decreases, or how often do I have to do those increases? So you are just matching the shape that you would have in the fingering weight with the worsted weight. But there's more to it. Even if it is just a plain stockinette sweater, the drape of the fabric is very different with fingering weight than it is with worsted weight. Fingering weight is a thinner yarn, so the stitches are not just smaller in terms of how wide they are, but also how thick they are. So a worsted weight yarn is going to be, the fabric is going to be thicker, and it's just not going to drape in the same way that fingering weight would. So you're going to have a difference in the fabric. And often what that means is you're going to have a difference in the amount of ease that you need. So maybe with a fingering weight sweater, you can get away with, or really like, 1 or 2 inches worth of ease. But in worsted weight, that might feel like it's too form-fitting and you might want another extra inch of ease, which means you kind of need to adjust for that measurement as well. So that's just working with plain stockinette and trying to match the shapes. Then what you run into is the stitch patterns and how important stitch counts and row counts are to the stitch pattern. So if you're working, say, a textured stitch pattern that's like seed stitch or something like that, it may not make a huge difference to work that in worsted weight compared to fingering weight. It is going to make a difference if you're doing something like cables, because the cables have the same number of stitches. So you might either need to change the stitch count in the cables, or you might just have to live with the difference in scale. So if you have a cable that's 6 stitches wide and you are using fingering weight, it's going to be a very tiny cable in terms of how wide it is. You use 6 stitches in worsted weight, it's going to be much bigger because each stitch is bigger. So you have to think about that. Like if you really like the delicacy of whatever it is that's knit in fingering weight, how is that really going to translate to your worsted weight? Then the next problem is when you have stitch patterns that really have a specific number of rows and create something that's a horizontal pattern. Maybe you're working with the bands of stranded color work and you have 10 different bands that you're doing in fingering weight. Well, you're not going to be doing 10 bands of that. You're not going to be doing all 10 bands. If you're working in worsted weight, you're going to have fewer. And then how is that going to play out? The scale of those designs are going to be different. And it's especially true when you're doing something like intarsia, which is what my Roaring 20s sweater is, where you have like the color block and you have like, basically it's called a picture knit. So if you were using fingering weight yarn, you could have a lot of stitches and have a pretty elaborate motif taking up, the front of the sweater. You may not be able to do that at all in worsted weight, because if you were to use the same number of stitches and the same number of rows, it may not even fit on the sweater. So then you'd have to try to scale it down and it would create, just not as fine looking, detailed picture as it would be if it were in the fingering weight. You can sometimes translate those, but typically that is such a difference in gauge and a difference in yarn that it probably wouldn't be worth doing. It makes more sense. It's easier to make those kind of adjustments when the two yarns are very close to each other, like a DK weight yarn versus a worsted weight yarn. Those kinds of substitutions tend to be much better in terms of getting the result that you want. And at the same time, you can often knit a different size from that pattern just using the different yarns. So you might be able to knit a smaller size with a thicker yarn because the stitch counts of the smaller size would work out well for the larger sweater. And vice versa, if you had a worsted weight sweater, you could knit a larger size if you were using DK weight yarn and knitting at the gauge that was appropriate for that DK weight yarn. Sometimes those substitutions are pretty easy, and the difference in the scale of the stitches isn't going to be noticeable, but fingering weight versus worsted weight is pretty dramatic, just like worsted weight and bulky weight would be pretty dramatic. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.